So as we've just heard, the state and territory leaders are accusing the Prime Minister, trying to force them into a corner and get them to lead calls for a rise in the GST rate.
But could that actually be the answer? Look, a higher GST might bring the budget into surplus, or it could just be another blow to Aussies who are already struggling. As I said, to discuss the pros and cons of a higher GST, we've got our finance guru, Scott Hayward, who's in Melbourne, and President of the Australian Association of Social Workers, Professor Karen Healy, who joins us from Brisbane. Thanks for being on the show, guys. Let's start with you, Karen. Why do you think this is a terrible idea, and who would be worse off?
Well, the Australian Association of Social Workers is opposed to any raising or broadening of the GST because of the terrible impact it would have on low-income people. These people already pay a much larger proportion of their income on basics like food, healthcare and education, and raising the GST would push these people further to the edge. And that's why we're very concerned about the current discussion about raising or broadening the GST.
Scott, New Zealand has just announced a budget surplus after a GST rise to about 15%. Would it do the same for Australia? Is a rise in the GST a good idea?
Well, they say that politicians would make good weightlifters because they like to lift taxes. And in New Zealand, they lifted the GST back in 2010 to 15%, and now they're in surplus. Now, admittedly, they've had the same Prime Minister for that period of time, but unfortunately in Australia, you've got a political and an economic front that is going to be challenged. From a political point of view, there's no way that Tony Abbott can change anything to the GST because that was his big promise that he wouldn't touch it. But from an economic point of view, most Australians think that we're paying GST on everything, but we're not paying GST on our water bills, we're not paying GST on private school fees, and we're not paying GST on childcare and fresh food. Now, I would argue that if the previous person who spoke, you know, people are already paying on packaged food, and I suppose you could say any food that is frozen, etc., already GST. So would low-income earners hurt that much if GST was on everything? As I said, I think most Australians think GST is on everything anyway.
Scott, I think the concern is that it hurts poorer people disproportionately, and that's the big problem.
Well, some of the numbers that came out is if GST went just on those things, the Australian government would raise $15 billion of revenue, and that could get, you know, tunnelled out to low-income earners. So I suppose you could say that it would be something that should be definitely looked at, but as I said, it will probably happen in the next budget, I suppose, from 2017, because it would be absolutely political suicide for Tony Abbott. But the Kiwis, I suppose you could say, they are thinking to themselves, you know, we're doing a wee bit better than the Aussies at the moment because they're back in surplus.
Karen, what are your thoughts on this? You know, there's been a school of thought that we actually need to look at a whole overhaul of our tax system. Is that something that you would support?
I'd support an overhaul of the tax system, but to look at other areas such as the generous concessions on things like capital gains, also on superannuation and negative gearing. We, again, are very concerned about the ideas of raising the GST or even including things like fresh food. I'd also like to make the point that Australia is suffering from an obesity epidemic and a range of chronic diseases as a result of that. I think one of the great things about our current GST system is the exclusion of things like fresh food. And this can create an incentive for people to eat fresh food rather than processed foods.
Scott,
and that will give savings to our health system in other ways. So it benefits us to have some of these exclusions that currently exist.
Scott, from your perspective, do you think an increase in the base and also the level of GST would actually get us out of this debt that we're in?
Well, I think that most Australians right now are very confused with all of the budget reforms and budget cuts. And as we've discussed, some of them might not even go through the Senate, so we don't even know where we're at. But an increase to GST would make a lot of sense because it's very simple and people can understand it, and then we can make a decision as to what we pay for. And that lady is right, you know, it might actually create, I suppose you could say, an epidemic in health issues if it isn't reformed. But from my point of view, a reform would definitely be positive, but I think it's going to have to happen from 2017 because it would be a political disaster for Tony Abbott. He'd end up feeling like Julia Gillard with the carbon tax problem if he changed the GST.
Scott and Karen, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
think a good point that was made is the fact that there's a lot of confusion and the system needs to be completely overhauled.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to see how this plays out with the premiers because they are furious.
So
And
they
I
should
don't
be.
think that Tony Abbott expected them to come out swinging just as hard as they have.